Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 24. Maddox grew still in his seat, chiseled from stone as he stared at Clara with a blank expression on his face. How do you know this? They probably promised him power in exchange for his help, and like the dumbass he is, he accepted. Zeke muttered under his breath. They were probably going to kill him off once they got what they wanted. Yet. Me. I swallowed, glancing at him. They would have used my magic, I'm sure of it. When you two were fighting, he had a witch using magic on you. I sent Mason off to find her, but he didn't have any luck. Chances are she was being protected and whoever was doing the protecting pulled her out the minute you won, which shouldn't have happened, by the way. Clara replied to Maddox's question, leaning back in her chair. I swallowed the knot of unease in my stomach at the thought of Maddox losing. What do you mean it shouldn't have happened? Clara looked me straight in the eyes and said, your mate should be DD, but he isn't and I don't know why. What? Zeke sputtered, his eyes going wide. What do you mean he should be DD? I've seen Alpha Bran fight dozens of times, there's no way he should have been able to beat him. There isn't a single Alpha that can one-up Maddox. Even I only stand a couple minutes against him before I tap out. The magic that witch was working should have weakened him until he couldn't fight anymore. At that point, I assume Alpha Bran would have ended things. Clara winced, her eyes flickering to where I sat. I felt a rumbling in my chest and realized I'd been growling. Both Maya and I hated the thought of using magic against an Alpha he challenged himself. Not only was it disrespectful, but cheating like that was grounds for an immediate disqualification. Also commonly referred to as an EN. Clara held up her hands in an act of surrender. Look, if I had the power, I would have stopped the B*H. If Mason had gotten his claws on her, I would have zapped her into next week. That being said, the witch's magic didn't work on Maddox. If it had, he'd be DD. No one's blaming you. Alpha Bran was known for being a coward. I think it's just a bit shocking he stooped as low as working with the witches. Mason said quietly, his words directed to Clara. If I'd been paying more attention to Mason rather than what Clara had said, I would have noticed the way his tone softened when he spoke to her and how there was an obvious lack of hostility in his voice that hadn't been there before. Her magic didn't work on Maddox. I blurted the question out loud, not expecting any sort of response. Sure, didn't. Alpha Bran seemed surprised at that fact. She replied. Zeke chimed in, that's why he looked so shell-shocked. He chuckled. I thought it was because Maddox had just put him on his A*S. I'm sure he wasn't too happy about that part, but that wasn't why he looked like his eyes were gonna pop out of his head. No, someone used magic on your mate and that's what kept him safe from Alpha Bran's witchy ally. Clara nodded, her tone confident. Clearly, she'd thought this through and after analyzing each and every alternative, the only answer she could come up with is that someone else had protected Maddox. Oh. Suddenly, all eyes were on me. Even Mason had stopped mid-sentence to tilt his head and peer at me curiously. Clara shifted in her seat, leaning forward. Now, my intuition ain't that great, but if I didn't know any better, you look like you just figured something out. She said pointedly, tapping one of her manicured nails on the surface of the table. So, I sorta did a protection spell on you. I cringed at the sound of my own voice, and waited for Maddox's reaction. He tilted his head, and if I didn't know any better, I swore he looked almost impressed. You put a protection spell on me?" he repeated. I nodded, nibbling on my lower lip as I fought the urge to look away. A quick glance around the room told me how everyone was feeling, but there was one face I purposefully skipped over. Clara looked at me like she couldn't tell if I were a genius, while Mason and Zeke had identical looks of surprise. Clara narrowed her eyes, skewering me with shards of amber. "When exactly did you do this protection spell?" "The same day he left, I think." I cleared my throat. "Maybe the day after." "You don't remember when you did the spell?" she asked, her voice oozing with skepticism. "Look," I began, but Tristan's brittle laughter cut me off. "A sleepover, hey?" he said, his incredulous expression making me want to laugh and apologize all at once. It was the most expression I'd ever seen him display. His eyebrows were lifted and baby blues piercing as they stared me down. His lips were flattened into a thin line, that amplified the harshness of his jaw and cheekbones. "Boy talk, pillow fights, and sappy romance movies, right? You just conveniently left out the witchcraft part. Was it Holly's idea to help or did you recruit her?" Biting my tongue, I replied with only a small hint of sass. "Does it really matter? What's done is done, and Maddox is well and alive because of it. As far as I'm concerned, it's a win. Who knows what would have happened if we hadn't done it?" "I can tell you what would have happened," Clara muttered, her eyes darkening. Tristan scowled, and somehow I had the feeling my response was the answer he was looking for. He huffed, "I should have figured she'd offer her help. She's just as much trouble as you are, she's just better at hiding it." "I could hide it if I wanted to," I shot back. He snorted, his lips twitching as he fought a smirk. "I don't believe you in the slightest. Tell me, what did your witchy trainers have to say about this?" I opened my mouth to respond before remembering neither Cordelia or Rowena knew about the protection spell. At the time, I knew they'd only try to stop me. Going behind their backs was a necessary measure considering it had saved Maddox's life in the end. The pale tones in Tristan's eyes darkened as he stared me down. I refused to squirm under his gaze. After all, I was the queen here, not him. Even if the image was amusing to conjure up. "They don't know, do they?" he grunted, swiping a hand down his face. "I got the spell from one of Cordelia's books, and I got the book from Using Conjuration, I just didn't know it at the time," I confessed, turning to Maddox who had remained neutral throughout all of this. "Look, I don't regret what I did, especially knowing it kept you from being KD by Alpha Bran. I can't even imagine what would have become of this pack with him in charge. I shouldn't have used magic on you without your consent, just like I shouldn't have gone behind Rowena and Cordelia's backs. I plan on returning her spell book today along with telling her the truth. I assume you'll ask her what the risks were in casting a spell like this?" Tristan murmured, his tone softening. Zeke frowned, maybe that's what made Maddox go all feral. It would have been an easy answer, but something about it felt wrong. How would a protection spell cause someone's wolf to go insane? The math just wasn't adding up. Judging from Clara's crinkled nose and down-turned lips, I'd say she agreed with me. Something's telling me that's not what caused it, but it still wouldn't hurt to ask. I replied, then looked towards my stoic mate. "How do you feel about all of this?" As his warm eyes settled on mine, swirling with hints of gold that told me his wolf was nearby, he opened the bond between us and let me into his head. There was no blame within his thoughts, all of which were neatly organized where mine was a strait of madness. He'd already moved on from the surprise of learning about the protection spell, and was sorting through different theories he had surrounding my newly discovered magic. His smile was soft and intimate, an expression anyone else would overlook. You did what you thought was right at the time and it paid off. I think returning the book and getting Cordelia's advice is a sound idea. Perhaps there's more you can ask her. When his eyes drifted to my family tomb, which was still sitting on the table, I realized he might be onto something. You think she might know something about conjuration? Maddox half shrugged, it couldn't hurt to ask. With my eyes still on the book, I hummed. No, it couldn't. I looked around the room, at the people who surrounded me, the emotions that were carved across the canvas of their faces. Each one had their own stake in this, their own fears and hopes when this battle finally came to its head. I couldn't afford to be afraid any longer. Fear wouldn't help me master my magic, nor would it help me defeat the Blood Witch. I swiped the book from the table and stood, straightening my spine as I inhaled sharply. Well, I guess I know what I'm doing today. It took Maddox some convincing to leave the holding cell. The last thing he wanted to do was have another episode and wind up hurting somebody. The two of us planned on speaking to Cordelia and Rowena together. I'd bite the bullet and give Cordelia her spell book back, while also apologizing for stealing it, even if it had been unintentionally, and Maddox would have Rowena check him over a second time for any hint of magic or spell work. We had a few hours to KL considering Rowena was currently with Holly for their training session, which gave me plenty of time to swing by the house to grab the spell book and to do something that returned just a shred of normalcy to my life. It had been days since I'd last stepped foot in a training class, and I was honestly beginning to miss sparring and testing out my skills. There was a comfort with training one couldn't get in the real world. I didn't have to think about losing my life on the mats, or whether or not my opponent was out to KL me. Plus, it gave me the perfect opportunity to check up on Cassidy, who had been blowing my phone up since Tristan and I slipped out of the pack's boundary lines. Maddox dropped me off at training and went to see his parents. They were freaking out, and rightfully so, over everything that had happened to the two of us. It didn't help that Brandon had been the one to tell them, and undoubtedly added his own embellishments to the story, which was a mess Maddox was eager to clear up. When I plopped down beside Cassidy, I thought my eardrums might burst with how loudly she squealed. "Lola! Thank the goddess you're all right!" she exclaimed, slapping a hand against her sports bra-covered chest. She blinked rapidly, her baby blues bright with relief. Lowering her voice, even though all eyes and ears were turned our way, she murmured quietly. "I was debating organizing a rescue team to go after you. Spearheaded by me, of course." I laughed at her dramatics, already settling into the illusion of the routine I'd once had. "It's a good thing you didn't." Things were chaotic and dangerous for a while there, for Maddox too, unfortunately. We're both safe and sound, though. Cassidy glanced around the room almost warily, skewering all of the eavesdroppers with a cold look that had them turning back to their own conversations. She chewed on her lower lip, her nervousness bleeding through her every move. I went to put my hair into a ponytail but found I didn't have a hair tie. As many fights as I end up getting into, you'd think I'd have one on me constantly. For now though, right? Everyone's been talking about it, you know, Maddox's victory. Tensions are rising, and I'm not talking about just inside the pack. She whispered, bringing another pack into the fold, especially one that tried to stand against us, might put us all in more danger. Maddox wouldn't do anything to put the people here in harm's way, but he's also going to do his duty to Bran's former pack and take care of them, as well. Like the humans say, things get worse before they get better. I sighed, gratefully accepting the hair tie Cassidy offered. Once my hair was out of the way and no longer tumbling down my back, I began stretching. Is there anything I can do to help? Cassidy asked, mirroring my movements, and bending to the side to touch her left foot. We held the stretch for a few seconds before switching legs. I paused, thinking for a moment before responding. Right now all I want is a bit of normalcy. I know it's silly, and things are far from okay, but I keep feeling like the world is just tilting under my feet and I'm fighting to stay upright. I just need a small break, even if it's just for a couple hours. It was Cassidy's turn to go quiet, and she stayed that way up until Amelia waltzed into the room. When the trainer took her position at the front of the classroom, Cassidy chirped excitedly. "Oh, I have the best idea. We should do a sleepover cookout." Amelia had us all split into groups and begin sparring, which meant Cassidy and Elle were paired together. We circled one another, not yet throwing any jabs even though some of the other groups had viciously launched into their own attacks. I lifted an eyebrow at her, taken off guard. "You think so?" She scoffed at me, swatting my shoulder playfully. Her golden ponytail swayed as she danced on her feet. "You've never been to an event hosted by yours truly, have some faith. Are you free tonight, by chance?" Shrugging, I said. "Unless something else horrible happens, which I'm praying it doesn't, I'm free." "Awesome!" She beamed, punching the air. "You invite whoever's coming and I'll handle everything else. Oh, and the sleepover portion is no guys allowed, so relay the information to your mate." She snickered, then shifted into a fighting stance. "All right, a sleepover cookout it is." I nodded, a smile of my own forming as I mirrored her stance and plotted my first line of attack. After training had finished and every ounce of anxiety had been beaten and forced from my body, I was pulled aside by Amelia. Cassidy waved goodbye and shouted a reminder that I needed to invite everyone for the cookout tonight, along with a heads up that she was going to drop by my place to set things up in just a couple hours. I didn't miss the lingering glance she tossed Amelia's way or how the fearless trainer returned it without flinching. "Hey, I just wanted to thank you for contacting that trainer of yours. He accepted the job here and caught the first flight available," she said warmly, her eyes the same bright shade of umber as her curly hair. Noticing my surprised expression, some of her joy waned and she asked, "You did talk to him, right? Please tell me Elle didn't just invite some random here." I giggled at the note of panic in her voice and shook my head. "No, don't worry. I'm sorry, I've just had so much going on that I forgot I'd asked my grandma to call him. I'm honestly surprised he accepted, he's kind of antisocial, and a grump, but he is an amazing trainer." Amelia's smile returned tenfold, pairing with her muscular physique perfectly. She was often intimidating, but once her scowl melted away, she came off as friendly and approachable. "That's a relief. Your grandma must have gotten through to him somehow. All I know is we can use the new edition. Maybe I'll even get a day off myself. If anything, grandma probably promised a lifetime supply of her baking." I chuckled, "Once he starts, you should definitely take some time off. With what's going on in the world, we should spend all the time we can with family and friends. Make sure you do the same, Luna," Amelia said, her expression softening. I told Maddox about Cassidy's idea in the car. He had picked me up from the training center and seemed considerably less stressed since talking to his parents. Apparently, it had all gone well. His parents were looped in on what was going on and were planning on calling his aunt to relay the news. Surprisingly, Brandon didn't embellish the story all that much and managed to stick to the truth. Maddox was more than on board with Cassidy's plan, even if it meant we didn't get the night alone together. As much as I longed for some one-on-one time with Maddox, I wanted to invite Brianna and get her out of the house. Giovanni had called not too long ago to check up on me, curious about how I had removed Tristan's mark. He let me know that Brianna had holed herself up in the bedroom and refused to see anyone or eat anything. I understood her grief and wouldn't try to force her out of it, but I wanted her to know that she had people here for her, people who cared and wanted to help however they could. I might invite my parents. What do you think? Maddox asked, squeezing my th with his meaty hand, drawing my attention back to the present. I nodded absent-mindedly. I think that would be nice. Invite Dad and Grandma while you're at it, Sean, and Mason too. I think we could all use a night off. I'll take care of it. Just so you know, if I invite Mason, Clara's going to come as well. I also assume you're going to invite Brianna as well. He commented, to which I nodded a second time. I'd have to ask him about the Mason and Clara development later. Any ideas on how you'll get her to show? I didn't need to stop and think about my response. I'd already formulated a plan in my head. Good, old-fashioned bribery. I replied, a sheepish grin forming on my face. When we pulled into the gravel driveway of the house the witches were staying at, I took my chance to mind-link Brianna. Maddox stayed in the car, giving me the illusion of privacy as I walked towards the end of the drive and lingered by an old weeping willow. Brianna! I called out to her, softening my voice before sending it over the mind link. There was a tug in my chest, one so very different from the mate bond that it made me pause. It was the newly forged connection between Brianna and I, one of pure magic and shadow. I could feel her presence like it were right next to me, like she had just walked down the street and appeared in the driveway herself. Hey, Lola! Her voice was quiet, hoarse from the crying I somehow knew had lasted all night and day. I chewed on my lower lip, battling the guilt and frustration that swirled in my stomach, fighting off the hopelessness it spawned. Cassidy had this idea for a sleepover cookout thing at my place and I'd really like it if you would come. If you wanted to, I mean. I know you're going through a lot and wanted space, but we'd all love to see you. Everyone's going to be there, even Clara and Mason, who clearly have something going on. They've been glued to each other's sides since they got back, even though Maddox trusts her now and told Mason he didn't have to babysit her anymore. I added, knowing she'd love a juicy tidbit of gossip, even if she was deep in mourning. It sounds fun and all, but I just don't think. Wait, you said there's something going on with Clara and Mason? Clara, the witch. She still sounded devastated, but her voice held a hint of curiosity I couldn't help but notice. When did this development happen and why weren't we the first people he's told? There's my best friend, I smiled to myself. Seriously, I thought the same thing. It's like he doesn't appreciate our friendship. I was hoping you'd torment him with me at the cookout, but I suppose I can pick up the slack myself. I sighed dramatically, feeling my heart skip a beat when her muffled giggle traveled through the mind link. Anyway, there's more that's happened, and I really need someone to talk about it, someone I trust. I'll explain how the next time I see you in person, but I kind of discovered my magic and used it to get Tristan's mark off my neck. Insane, right? Oh, it explains the shadow beast part. It explains a lot of things, actually. I grunted. Brianna went silent for a few seconds, and through the link I could practically feel the gears in her head turning. She let out a soft sigh, sniffled, then blew her nose. All right, I'll be there, she said, and I knew then that the grin that spread across my face would leave my muscles aching all day long. Rowena answered the door when we knocked, and immediately took Maddox into the den to scan him for any charms, spells, or curses. She pointed me upstairs where Cordelia was, and as I climbed the stairs, I searched for the words to say. It had been an accident, stealing the book, but once I had it I'd knowingly cast a spell from its pages. "Come in, Lola," Cordelia called out, her back turned to me as she rummaged through the old trunk in her bedroom. There were stacks of magical textbooks, the entire culmination of Cordelia's collection throughout the years. Most of which she'd gotten from her family, but there were a handful she procured from powerful friends and distant cousins. She'd told me previously that she had charmed the box to vanish should anyone try to break into it. When I entered her bedroom, which was a cocoon of tapestries and billowing fabrics, she had just snapped the lid shut. The bangles around her wrists were clinking as they hit into one another, playing the same song as the numerous amulets around her neck. Her graying hair was braided, trailing down her shoulder until it stopped around her waistline. She met my gaze and frowned, the lines around her mouth becoming more prominent. "What's wrong?" Cordelia asked, placing a hand against the amulets she wore. "You look positively torn." "There's nothing wrong." "Well, not exactly," I said, sg my nerves as I struggled to get to the point. Instead of speaking, I rummaged through the old tote bag I wore and pulled out her spell book. I could pinpoint the exact second that realization flooded her eyes, bringing on a light of distrust that made my stomach curdle and sour. I casted a protection spell on Maddox, but I swear I never meant to steal the book. Her eyebrows, which were naturally soft, fell into a sharp grimace. With the wave of her hand, the bedroom door clicked shut. She looked down at the book, then thumbed through its pages, leaving me to drown in the uncomfortable silence. "So, you accidentally stole my book, then proceeded to cast a risky spell on your mate, one that could have had horrible consequences if you had messed up a single detail in the slightest, am I correct?" she said, pinning me in place with a look that could have easily belonged to my mom or grandma. Ruefully, I nodded. Cordelia made a sound of understanding, then began tapping her nails along the hard cover. "Thank you for telling me the truth. I was wondering when my book would turn back up. I was beginning to think the gnomes had taken it." She spoke. "The gnomes?" She stared blankly at my confused expression before snorting and shaking her head. "It's a joke, Lola. Though, I would like to know how you stole my book, even if it was by accident." With the book in her hands, and the jeweled rings on her fingers sparkling merrily, she turned to slide the book into her trunk. Feeling a blush creep along my cheeks, I swallowed and asked, "Does the term conjuration mean anything to you?" She froze, her back still turned to me as she murmured, "That's a word I haven't heard in a very long time." Clicking the lock on her trunk shut a second time, Cordelia stood and turned to face me. Her eyes were calculating, though not in a sinister sort of way, more like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. "That's what your magic is. It's how you stole my book, through conjuration." Cordelia wasn't asking. No, this was a statement, a fact she knew to be true. The harder I looked at her, the more certain I was that she couldn't possibly be the spy the Blood Witch had sent. There was no trace of greed on her face. If anything, there was sympathy. "You poor child," she said quietly, nearly fracturing my heart with fear. She sank slowly onto the bed and placed a hand on the post for support. "That's why they want you so badly. Oh, the damage they could do. No, they won't get the chance. I'm going to master this. It's not going to control me, just like they aren't going to control me. I was not going to be a pawn. Not now, not ever." Cordelia lifted her chin, a hint of pride flashing in her eyes. "Good, because that's your only option. It's going to get worse for you now." It always does once the witch knows what her magical type is, and for a witch of conjuration, it makes things incredibly dangerous. How do you know about conjuration, Cordelia? I thought it wasn't well known. It's not, but I come from a very old family, from a long line of witches. Word travels through the generations, and I'm more than certain I'm not the only witch that knows. She replied. I thought back to Ember and Tessa, to what they had said in the warehouse. Two of the Blood Witch's assassins mentioned they needed to get to me before I realized the true extent of my magic. I'd bet anything that they know about conjuration too. In the book I have, it says nothing about how to master it. There's a handful of pages missing, and I can't help but wonder what information they had on them. You don't think it was important, do you? Cordelia frowned. I think anything having to do with conjuration is important, Lola. Wherever those pages are, let's hope they aren't in the wrong hands. I suppose we'll have to up your training now. What I want you to do is to practice conjuration every chance you get, but do so very carefully. Mind your thoughts, don't put too much feeling and energy into them, especially the ones born from anger. Try your magic out on harmless things. The minute the words left her mouth, I found myself focusing on that trunk of hers. I dug into the pit of need hiding inside of me, nestled deep within bones, the same one I'd pulled from all those other times when I thought I was just invoking my magic. It wasn't a particularly strong thought, yet the lid to the trunk flung itself open not a second later. Cordelia jumped, slapping a hand against her chest as she shouted in surprise. I blinked, my eyes darting between her and the trunk. A yawn tickled the back of my throat, but I kept it at bay. I barely had to think about that, but I could use a nap now. Yes, well, she stammered, clearly surprised. It'll take time for you to build up a tolerance, which is why you need to practice. However, I do not recommend stealing any more of my book. Her voice changed from surprised to stern within seconds. I held my hands up in surrender. I promise you it won't happen again. Good. She nodded, pleased and seemingly convinced. Now, tell me about this protection spell you did. After explaining to her the spell Holly and I placed on Maddox, down to the smallest of details like where we'd placed the candles in correspondence to one another, she made a sound of disbelief deep in her throat. You just can't stay out of trouble. She chuckled, shaking her head. I swore there was a hint of pride in her eyes that she fought to cover up. You say the spell saved his life. According to Clara, he would have died if I hadn't. Well, Rowena will be able to detect if the protection spell is still on Maddox, but typically it fades with time. The fact that it lasted that long with you being a beginner speaks volumes about your power. What's done is done, but I still believe you should know the risks involved with what you did. She tugged. The risks? Oh, yes. Every spell has its risks, and there's a reason even seasoned witches steer clear of protection spells. In essence, a protection spell links the life force of one with the life force of another. Maddox was very much protected, but should you have died? Well, so would he. She explained, and only now did I fully realize the dangers of the spell I had done. She patted my shoulder gently, just like Grandma did. Don't worry, dear. Let's go see what Rowena has to say, shall we? When we made it downstairs, there was no sign of the auburn-haired witch. Maddox sat on the sofa, his eyes glazed over from the mind link he was currently in the middle of. Seconds went by before they cleared. He blinked rapidly and stood, coming to my side. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed his touch until his arm was around my waist, pulling me into his side. All of the anxiety and stress melted away, vanishing much faster than it had during training. Where did Rowena go? I asked him, looking around but finding no sign of her. She got a phone call and had to leave, said it wasn't a big deal. He replied, Cass made it to the house and said if we had nothing better to do we can help her set things up. I've already mind-linked your dad and the others. They'll be there in a few hours. I turned to Cordelia, did you want to come? We're having a cookout tonight. Cordelia's eyes softened, taking some of the years out of her face, but none of the wisdom. It's quite all right. Actually, I could use an afternoon of relaxing myself. I may just meditate some and take a long bath. Her eyes traveled to Maddox's face. Did Rowena find any magic clinging to you, Alpha? Maddox shook his head, and a pang of relief stung my chest. She said I'm clean, which is great but doesn't explain what made my wolf go feral. She felt the echo of the protection spell Lola did, but she was confident it wore off. Thank the goddess. I sighed, earning a confused look from Maddox. I'll explain in the car. The middle-aged witch nodded, her expression troubled yet thoughtful. While that is a good thing, a protection spell wouldn't have affected your wolf in that way. If it's magic that made your wolf lose control, then I believe Rowena would have been able to sense it. Is there any chance stress could be involved? Maddox and I shared a look. We both knew that Cordelia meant well, but she wasn't a werewolf herself. Stress might have been a factor at first, when Maddox's protective nature had worsened, but stress alone wouldn't cause a wolf to go feral. Our wolves were meant to steady and guide us, not send us head first into chaos. No, what turned Maddox's wolf feral had to be something else, something Rowena missed. We made it back to the house within the hour. As we pulled into the circular drive, parking next to the granite fountain Maddox had installed, the first thing we spotted was Cassidy's smiling face. Her cheesy grin made sense the moment Kendrick came into view, carrying bags of groceries from her car into the house. Between the four of us, we managed to get everything set up before the first of our guests arrived, which just so happened to be Grandma, Dad, and Sean. I spotted Flora alongside them and smiled at how her and Dad had their arms wound around one another's waists. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, other than my dad smiling ear to ear, I went back to work and waited for them to come inside. I could hear them before I saw them, pinpointing Sean's laugh first and foremost. It was raspy, which made sense considering my big brother was a grown man, but still had that squeak that reminded me of the scrawny little boy I'd grown up beside. When the four of them made their way into the kitchen, I noticed instantly something had changed. It didn't take long to figure out what that something was. The second my dad moved, untangling himself from Flora's petite form to pull me in for a hug, I saw it. "Dad, what the?" I stammered, pushing him away. He didn't take any offense to my actions, and actually smiled when I held him at a distance and scanned my eyes up and down his body. The grizzly man looked the same, only he was freshly shaven for once in his life. Instead of crazy caveman vibes, his beard gave off more of a refined lumberjack look. What made me push him away like a mad woman was that he didn't limp when he approached me. Not only that, but his usual grimace was gone, the one signaling to the world that his knee was hurting him. "Can you believe it, Lola? I'm healed." He grinned, like a full-fledged grin that brightened his eyes and removed just about every line and crevice on his face, making him look younger than I'd ever seen him. For emphasis, he did a little spin, splaying his hands out like he'd done a backflip. His joy was contagious and his confidence inspiring as he said, "Not only did I spend the morning in the hospital getting x-rayed, but I also had Rowena check me out. There's no injury there to be seen. No shrapnel, no scar tissue, nothing. It's like the accident never happened." Dad's grin didn't falter, remaining intact while I picked my jaw up off the floor. He chuckled, the sound warm and throaty, while tugging Flora over to his side. The woman with the kind eyes and soft curls smiled at me, her pink lips matching the petals on the dress she wore. She was clearly nervous, twiddling her fingers and glancing around the kitchen with interest. I felt a tad guilty considering I hadn't really spoken more than a couple words to Flora. The last thing I wanted her to think was that I had a problem with her and my dad being mates. "That's great, Dad. You're like a whole new person, but how did this happen?" I had to ask, glancing over at Grandma when she made a noise in her throat. She said nothing, currently hunched over as she stuffed our refrigerator full of her homemade sweets. There were Tupperware containers stacked on the shelves, and from a distance I could make out a couple batches of cookies and even a plate of brownies. I'd have to sneak away later on and steal a few before Maddox and Zeke scarfed them all down. Dad heard it too, his grin widening as he shrugged. It made sense he wouldn't be too worried about how it happened, only that it had. He jutted his chin in Grandma's direction and said, "Had to be your grandma working her magic. I told you 4 times now it wasn't me that fixed your leg." Grandma huffed, swatting at him as she closed the refrigerator door. Dad shrugged, "All I know is I hope it lasts. Flora here has been teaching me how to dance. Can you imagine that, Lola? Your old man on the dance floor." I had to grin at what he said, laughing at the excitement on his face and how it made him less of a gruff veteran and more of a lovesick puppy. Before I could get more than a chuckle out, my smile fell. What he said about dancing, it plucked a memory from the back of my head, one I hadn't thought about since Tristan and I sped out of the pack via motorcycle. A familiar tickle started in my stomach as I remembered Flora and Dad dancing at the wedding. Seeing him like that, his face contorted in pain and shame while his eyes beady with longing, it broke a part of my heart that wanted nothing more than my dad's happiness. He'd been through so much, lost out on so many things with Flora that it didn't seem fair for him to miss out on this too. Grandma was the first to speak, instantly noticing the fallout in my joy. "What is it, Lola?" she asked, coming to my side, and placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. The scent of dried lavender followed her, mixing with her floral perfume to create a scent that was familiar and calming. Hearing the seriousness in her voice, Dad broke off his silent conversation with Flora and turned my way. His eyebrows creased with concern, the same salt and pepper shade as the hair on his head. I was connecting the dots, realizing that the burst of emotion I'd felt watching my dad and Flora dance was my magic manifesting itself. There was no point in hiding this from them, from the people I trusted more than anything in the world. Even though I hardly knew Flora, the way she looked at my dad had me wanting to trust her in the same way. She'd never replace my mom, and I knew she didn't want to, but she deserved happiness just as Dad did. "I think I'm the one that healed your leg, actually," I admitted. "It's a long story, but Maddox and I figured out my magical type. I can conjure things, make them real just by thinking about them. It's why the witches want to use me so badly." Understandably, no one looked too relieved to hear the truth. Everyone, Flora included, now had identical looks of unease on their faces. Dad's was mixed with anger, while Grandma's had small traces of worry. They both looked at one another, then at Maddox who had just walked into the room. "They're not going to get their hands on you though, isn't that right?" Dad said, but his question was directed at Maddox. Maddox came up behind me, his arms circling my waist and drawing an instant sigh of relief from my lips. His masculine scent and the heat of his skin melting against my own took the edge off and filled me with a sense of confidence that came from feeling safe. Dad knew as well as I did that Maddox would sooner send the entirety of our forces into battle if it meant keeping me protected, but I didn't blame him for needing reassurance. Apparently, neither did Maddox, because he replied without a hint of offense in his voice. I could feel his chest vibrating against my back, quaking with the gravely sound of his voice. Not a chance. We're going to take every measure possible to make sure she stays safe. I craned my head to look up at him. His lips, which looked irrevocably soft and kissable, twisted into a small smirk. It didn't matter that I was openly ogling him. Any time our eyes locked, it was like the room melted away, leaving us both alone in our own small bubble. Taking every measure possible doesn't mean I'm going to be locked away like a princess in a tower, though. I reminded them both, I have this power for a reason, and I'm going to use it to stop the witches. Lola, maybe that's not, Dad began, putting on his stern parental voice. First, you need to master it. No point in running headfirst into battle with this blood witch without knowing your stuff. Grandma chimed in, on my side as always. Pride sparkled in her eyes, but it had always been there, even when I was nothing more than a werewolf living in her little cottage in the woods. Dad side-eyed her, still grimacing. Mom, we're not sending my daughter up against an army of witches. Don't you look at me like that. I care about her just as much as you do, but even I can put aside my own feelings to see what's best for this world. She huffed, snapping her fingers. This doesn't just affect this pack. Maybe it did at first, but things have grown bigger than that. This fight can very well change things everywhere, and not for the better. Your daughter's been given a special sort of power, and power like that demands to be used. Yet. Tell him, Grandma. Zeke's whoop sounded from across the kitchen. The messy-haired alpha appeared in the entryway, a lopsided grin pasted onto his face. Dad skewered him with a look so vicious that Zeke held up his hands in surrender. The smile didn't slip from his face, and after a moment Dad let out a deep sigh. I know you're strong, Lola. Stronger than half the wolves in this pack, but that doesn't mean I still don't worry about you. You've taken on so much so young, and everyone has their limits. I'm just afraid of what might happen once you reach yours. He grunted. Dad's eyes carried a weight I'd noticed my entire life, but never fully understood. He'd been an incredible warrior in his prime, shot down during battle and grievously injured. In the span of one day, his entire life had been flipped on its head. I wondered if Dad had reached his own limits that day, and if that was why he mentioned what might happen once I reached my own. I slipped from Maddox's arms and stepped into my dad's, inhaling his woodsy scent, and smiling at the tobacco and leather notes of his cologne, a gift Mom had gotten him a few years ago. Even though I wasn't his daughter by blood, there was nothing but affection in his eyes. I know, Dad, but I have to fight. I have so many people counting on me, and letting them down isn't an option. I'm trying my best not to go into this blind. His smile turned wry, and his eyes glistened with the emotion he fought to hide. You've changed, you know that, kid? The old you would have charged in there and set the place on fire. You're becoming a better ruler each and every day, making your old man proud. Just remember that you're not in this alone, all right? You got so many people here wanting to help you, and you need to let them. I looked back at Maddox, my heart stuttering in my chest at the intimate smile that ghosted across his face. It would have looked out of place to anyone else, clashing with his sharp jawline and bottomless eyes, but not to me. He was confirming what my dad was saying without words, reminding me that no matter what was lost, he would always be here. I know, Dad. I replied, squeezing him one more time before returning to Maddox's side, drawn by that invisible tether between us. He chuckled, swiping beneath his eye before gesturing my way. Now tell us about this magic of yours and how it healed my leg. It won't wear off, will it? Settling into Maddox's arms, I leaned against his chest and thought over my dad's question. There wasn't any way for me to test whether or not it would wear off, so I went with what my gut was telling me. I'm pretty sure it won't wear off. If the doctors and Rowena said it's fully healed, then it should stay that way. Flora glanced between my dad and I before speaking softly, stunning just about all of us in the room. When exactly did you heal him? If you don't mind my asking, of course. She said, toying with her fingers, drawing my attention to the pale pink nail polish she wore. It was at the wedding Claire hosted, when you two were dancing. I saw Dad scowling, and I felt awful. I could tell he was in pain, but he was doing his best to hide it. I frowned, remembering the guilt like it were yesterday. There was nothing quite like the pain of watching your parents struggle, so close to having it all, but still weighed down by the past. I looked at Dad, matching his gentle smile with one of my own. All I know is that in that moment, I wanted you to be able to dance with her. Sean piped up, his mouth full and one of Grandma's lavender cookies in his hand. So wait a minute. You're telling me you can conjure things? Where does that kind of magic end? Like, are you restricted to just physical stuff, or can you make something appear out of thin air too? He asked, moving from his place against the counter. There was a look of excitement in his eyes that made me snort. I might have been the troublemaker growing up, but any time Sean had that look in his eye, he'd quickly end up tangled in his own mess. I shrugged, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm not sure. I still need to practice more. So far I've healed Dad's leg, opened a trunk, and stole a book from Cordelia. I'm pretty sure I also turned Brianna into some kind of shadow wolf and opened a door back at the warehouse Tristan and I were escaping. So, thinking back on it, I'm not sure conjuration has any limits. Sean made a sound of absolute wonder, his mouth stretching into a wide grin that actually had me snorting. A shadow wolf, are you serious? He hollered. He then proceeded to lean in and lowered his voice, whispering even though everyone in the room could still hear him. Do you think you could work your magic and do something about my hair? I'm pretty sure I'm going through some kind of early male pattern baldness, and the only thing worse than me being bald is having to wear baseball caps all of the time. He groaned, clenching his eyes shut. I'll take a mullet at this point, just fix me. Grandma made a sound of disbelief, then swatted at Sean. He danced out of her reach, using Dad and Flora as cover. Flora held her hand over her lips to quiet her giggle, while Dad scoffed at his son. Sean peeked over their shoulder and mouthed, "Pretty please. She is not using her magic to fix your silly hair problems." Grandma scolded him, but there wasn't any sternness in her voice. Sean appeared around Dad's bulky frame, his face a mask of defiance. It is not silly. Male pattern baldness is a serious condition. He shot back. Zeke nodded, murmuring his agreement, then grinned when Grandma turned her sights to him. From behind, I could feel Maddox's chest rumbling with amusement, watching the cluster of a conversation the three of them were getting into. Who's going bald? A voice called out, one that made me whip around, a smile spawning across my face. Brianna and Giovanni stood in the doorway, both glancing around the room with identical looks of confusion. The curly-haired vampire that towered over my best friend gave her an intimate look as he slid past. His pitch-black eyes met mine as he set a couple of 2-liter sodas on the counter. Brianna insisted on bringing something. He chuckled smoothly, the sound oddly similar to melted chocolate. I brought something a bit stronger. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey, one whose label was covered in thin cursive lettering. Maddox made a sound of surprise and with a chuckle, Giovanni handed him the bottle. The two men were so alike that Brianna and I found it hilarious. Both were reserved in their own ways but had this viciousness hiding just under the surface. "This is good," Maddox said, handing Giovanni back the bottle. Giovanni nodded, a quick JK of his sculpted jawline. "Some of the best." "Ah, they're bonding," Brianna whispered, a smile cloying at her lips as she slipped between the two of them and ended up at my side. I didn't hesitate to throw my arms around her, squeezing her hard enough to make her groan. Even with her fake sounds of pain, I could hear the laughter in her voice. "I'm so glad you decided to come," I told her. She smirked down at me, tucking a wavy strand of her hair behind her ear. "You didn't give me much of a choice, bribing me with information and whatnot. You were right, though. I needed to get out for a little bit. I'm still not all right, and I'm not sure I'll ever be, but I'm not going to give up and check out just because, you know." I took a moment to admire my best friend, marveling at her strength and resilience. It made sense that someone as radiant would be mated to a force like Giovanni. Everything would have been different if we hadn't started talking again, if she hadn't have forgiven me for ditching her for Tyler and his friends. Looking back, I don't know what I would have done without her. I laced my arm through hers and gave her a small smile. "You don't have to be all right. I think most people are a little bit broken, and that's okay. No one gets through life unscathed, we all end up wounded one way or another. I'm lucky I have such strong people in my life to help me get through those moments." A few hours after the sun had set and the chill of night kicked in, the rest of our guests showed up. Tristan and Holly stepped inside toting a cooler full of blood bags, which I eagerly took to the icebox in the garage. My reserved half-sister looked elegant as ever, wearing a midnight cocktail dress that somehow seemed to blend in perfectly. Her hair was identical to my own, falling down her back in long dark waves, only it was pinned back with a single crimson bow. She smiled shyly at everyone, but was quickly swept away by Cassidy, who had no qualms striking up conversation with anyone. Kendrick followed her around like a lost puppy, but judging by the cheeky grin on his face, he was just happy to be here. Tristan remained by her side, a detail I quickly noticed, but he too could only stay quiet for so long with Cass launching question after question at him. During their stay in Maddox's family home, Dad and Grandma had become good friends with his parents and wandered into the living room to chat. Sean tagged along, followed by Zeke, the two of them shoving one another and cracking jokes like old friends. Mason and Clara, who had been glued to one another's hips since wandering into the house, ventured onto the back porch with Brianna and Giovanni. From the kitchen I could hear Brianna grilling Mason over his relationship with Clara, but it was the witch that provided most of the answers. It was chaos in the best way possible, a sea of chatter and laughter that seemed to have no end. No matter what room you went into, you'd find the same thing. As the grill was being prepped, everyone picked at the sweets Grandma had brought. Not a single one of us was exempt from her baking skills. Not that I'd say anything, but I swore I saw Kendrick wrap a few cookies in a napkin before slipping them in his pocket. An hour or two passed and I found myself wandering onto the back porch, a chilled blood bag in my hand. Drinking the stuff was almost normal to me now, even when I left it in the bag rather than pouring it into a cup. My dad and Killian were manning the grill, though Dad had slipped inside for another beer. Brianna and Giovanni were perched on the outdoor sectional with Mason and Clara at their sides, each one sipping on a different drink, though by the smell I'm pretty sure Giovanni was drinking blood. After a short conversation with Killian, who was just as stoic and brooding as Maddox, I was waved down by Brianna. I plopped down in between Giovanni and Mason, inhaling the mouth-watering scent of grilled burgers and steaks that emanated from the smoke curling in the air. "All right, you lured me here. How exactly are you responsible for turning me into a shadow wolf?" Brianna asked, effectively silencing all other conversations going on. Even Mason and Clara turned to join in, both waiting curiously. Maddox's voice popped into my mind, floating through the mind link. "Want me to come out there?" he asked, his gruff voice making my heart skip a beat. "It's all right. I can explain things well enough. Besides, I don't think Zeke's commentary would help." I laughed, hearing his voice in the background. There was a gentle, reassuring brush of warmth through the mate bond before our mind link ended and I was left to explain the situation. My magical type is called conjuration. I can basically conjure things into existence, whether it be physical, like opening a door, or something like turning a regular wolf into a shadow beast. I don't know the actual limits on my power yet since the book we have is missing a bunch of pages, but I'm almost positive it's why your wolf is different now. Brianna had been listening, giving me her undivided attention, when her face contorted in confusion. "Did you want to make me into a shadow wolf? Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining, but was it intentional?" she asked. I answered the best I could given I didn't have all the answers and wasn't sure I ever would. "So, I don't think you were ever meant to get your wolf back. When it was taken from you, that should have been it, but something changed when you got hurt. I commanded them to save you, and instead of wanting to make a deal with me, they just listened. I think I used conjuration to make them obey me, and the solution was to give you your wolf back." "You think being in the Shadow's possession changed her wolf's form?" Giovanni stated, speaking for the first time in what felt like an hour. His eyes were as dark as the night sky but were as piercing as the moon itself. "That's exactly what I think," I agreed, taking a swig of blood. The minute it hit my tongue, my taste buds erupted, tingling from the sweetness and warmth. It filled my veins with the same feeling, sharpening the forest and back porch until everything seemed brighter in color. It's even more proof that I need to master this thing before it gets out of control. It's terrifying that any thought I have could become reality. Brianna squared her shoulders and straightened her spine. There was a look of determination on her face that only appeared when she was in training or about to battle. "You gave me my wolf's form back. It's only right that I do my duty as your best friend and help you. How are you supposed to master this? Where should we start?" Cordelia said to practice randomly, on things that aren't life or DH. I shrugged, "Your guess is as good as mine." Brianna went silent for a few seconds, tapping her chin. I fell into a conversation with Mason and Clara, who both seemed to have something going on between them. Clara was curled up on the sectional, her body pivoted towards Mason's. I couldn't help but notice the way she'd smile, curling her plump lips at him as she batted her eyelashes. From what I could tell, it wasn't one-sided either. When a breeze stirred and Clara shivered, Mason was quick to slip his jacket off and drape it over her shoulders. While talking to them, I'd been poking and prodding at the topic of their friendship. By no means was I against the two of them talking. I had no negative feelings towards Clara, and after all Mason had gone through, he deserved his happily ever after, even if it was one without his fated mate. I was close to getting an answer when Brianna piped up. "What was your brother saying about being bald?" she asked, that look of contemplation still on her face. I quirked an eyebrow at her, wondering where she was going with this. "He was having a moment. He's worried he's prematurely balding." She snapped her fingers, a grin spreading wide across her face. With her slender jawline and high cheekbones, she looked like a mischievous pixie. "Perfect. For your first practice session, fix your brother's hair. Giovanni lifted his shoulder in a half shrug, indifferent over his mate's idea. Clara had on a grin of her own, her curls bouncing as she nodded eagerly. Only Mason, whose wide eyes darted between the two of us, seemed unsure about the entire thing. I don't think that's a good idea. He chuckled nervously. Clara scoffed, jutting out her lower lip in a pout. I think it's a great idea. It's practice, which is exactly what Lola needs. Besides, it's just hair. What's the worst that could happen? Brianna chimed in, but Mason still seemed unconvinced. Just focus and make sure what you're wanting is very, very specific. Clara suggested. Her eyes twinkled with humor. Wouldn't want your brother to end up with a mohawk or something. Soft footfalls sounded inside the house, nearing closer to the patio doors. A second passed when Claire popped her head out, her eyes trailing over the five of us before darting over to where Killian stood manning the grill. Her eyes crinkled as she smiled, and within the fine lines on her face I could see traces of Maddox. She gave him her long lashes and plush lips, while Killian gave him the harsher aspects of his appearance. Claire eyed the five of us and asked, "What's just hair?" She padded over to Killian, wrapping her arms around his waist and watching as he flipped a couple burgers and checked the temperature of the steaks. They're talking about her brother, Sean. Apparently, he has a balding issue he'd like Lola to fix, and like the caring little sister she is, she's thinking about helping him. Killian remarked, the corners of his lips twitching into a knowing smirk. Claire, innocently oblivious to the underlying tone of Killian's voice, cooed sweetly. "Oh, how kind of you, Lola. I promise I'll keep my mouth shut. I'm sure he'll love the surprise." She pecked her husband on the cheek and wandered back inside. Her and Brianna both began cackling, their faces bright with laughter, uncaring of the two men that watched them with rapt attention. Even Killian was smiling, which was as odd as seeing Maddox smile. The two men were so tightly under wraps the slightest bit of emotion was shocking. I have a younger sister myself, so I'm well versed in the antics of siblings. Even when the entire pack was afraid of me, Claire included, she never was. He chuckled, then turned his attention back to the food he was grilling. I had to bite back my own giggle when an idea weaseled its way into my head, one spawned from Clara's comment. "All right, I'm going to do it," I decided, straightening my spine. My eyes fluttered shut and I told the four of them, "I'll need a minute to concentrate. If it works, it should be instantaneous." Darkness enveloped my vision, but I still had my other senses. I could feel the chilling brush of night against my skin, its breeze curling around my arms and speckling them in goosebumps. The smoky scent of charred meat clung to my nose, mouth-watering as it called on my empty stomach to awaken. One by one, I let them slip into the background, where I could no longer notice them. Just as I'd begun constructing the thought, I heard a familiar voice. "Whoa, what's she doing?" It was Zeke, and from the sound of it, he was close by. I didn't plan on answering, not that I needed to. Brianna was quick to reply, effectively hushing the eager alpha. "SHH. She's using her magic to give Sean hair," Brianna whispered, her voice fading into nothing. Zeke cursed then whispered, "I don't want to miss this." I could hear the sound of his footfalls and knew he had run back into the house. Returning to the task at hand, I thought of my brother and the role he filled in my life. He'd been my first best friend, and my first enemy. This time around, I didn't have to put much effort into it. Cordelia had been right when she said knowing my magical type would make it easier to call it forth. All I had to do was create a mental image of what I wanted, and I felt the electrifying stir of magic in my gut. Reaching out, I tapped into it and let it solidify the picture I'd created. A scream rang out, and my eyes snapped open. It was rough enough that it sounded masculine, but it was higher than any man's voice I'd ever heard. It was followed by a deep bellow of rich laughter. The five of us locked eyes, a second passing before we scrambled off the sectional and raced inside. More laughter rang out, varying in pitch and tone. I recognized my dad's and grandma's in the mix, along with Claire's. We sprinted through the kitchen, pushing past one another like children, to the source of the commotion. Everyone was in the living room, so it took a moment before I was able to spot who screamed. Giovanni made it first, followed by Brianna and then me. Clara and Mason came directly after, both craning their heads until they found what we were all looking for. Zeke was on the floor, clutching his stomach as he cackled. Dad was red-faced from trying to hold it in, and Grandma had her hand firmly planted against her forehead. Both Cass and Kendrick had ear-splitting grins on their faces while Claire and Flora giggled behind their hands. Maddox's was the last laugh I heard, his tone as deep and rich as Zeke's. I was so stunned by my mate's reaction that I almost didn't notice Sean. "Lola, this isn't what I meant at all," my big brother groaned, combing his fingers through the long mane of hair I'd given him. It was a wispy shade of blonde, a last-minute detail I didn't think would stick, and ended a few inches past his A*S. Seeing him like that left me stunned for a minute, not only because it actually worked but because of how different he looked. Brianna was the first to break the silence, and as always, she didn't disappoint. "So majestic," she murmured in amazement. Per her comment, the room was once again engulfed in laughter, this time mine included. For the rest of the night we laughed, ate, and talked. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had this much fun, where there wasn't some threat looming over my shoulder. Since taking on the responsibility of Luna and Queen of the Vampires, there wasn't much time to kick back and relax. Even Tristan and Giovanni seemed to be enjoying themselves. The latter was absorbed in a conversation with Maddox and his dad. Brianna kept her distance, but every time Giovanni's eyes lit up with interest, she'd practically squeal. Tristan was elbows deep in whatever argument Zeke had incited, but judging from the occasional smirks they gave one another, it wasn't serious enough to intervene. Before long, a few of us began packing things up. There were enough leftovers to feed a small army of humans, which meant there was just enough for Maddox and I to last the week with. Grandma's desserts, on the other hand. Those were gone before anything else. Dad and Grandma, along with Maddox's parents, were the first to leave. Sometime during the evening, Holly decided she wanted to stay for the sleepover Cassidy was hosting. She seemed a bit nervous, toying with the hem of her dress, but surprisingly, Clara took her aside and helped smooth things out. Since Maddox didn't feel comfortable leaving all of us here alone, we made a compromise. The guys would keep to themselves and find something to do, while the girls had full reign of the in-home theater, living room, and minibar. None of them objected to the idea, not once Maddox showed them the lounge and his aged whiskey collection. If anything, I think Giovanni might have been ready to swoon. "I'm totally down to hang out and drink, but can we maybe find a late-night barber or something first?" Sean asked, narrowing his eyes at me in particular when everyone burst into laughter. Even Tristan and Giovanni cracked a smile, and they were two of the most stoic men in the room. Zeke clapped him on his back and said, "Not to worry, man. I can cut your hair for you." "You can?" Sean asked dryly. "Sure can." Zeke nodded, "I've done it before." Placated with Zeke's answer, Sean lumbered into the lounge, jumping into the conversation Mason and Kendrick were having over Maddox's whiskey collection. Kendrick's entire face had lit up when Maddox invited him as well, right down to his hazel and green flecked eyes. It was wholesome and almost adorable the way Kendrick grinned and stammered, "I'd be honored, Alpha." When Sean was out of hearing distance, Brianna tapped Zeke on the shoulder and said, "You've cut hair before." "Yeah, when I was 7. Didn't do too bad if I do say so myself." Zeke shrugged, his grin downright cheeky. "Hey, Lola. If I mess up, you think you could regrow his hair a second time?" I yawned into the palm of my hand, only somewhat tired from using my magic the first time. The amulet Rowena had given me must have been doing its job, making it easier to focus my magic. Still, I hoped the wave of exhaustion I felt when conjuring would soon go away. It would royally sk if I spent the rest of my life dependent on midday naps. "Don't see why not," I replied. Cassidy quickly ushered the guys from the room and demanded we all change into something comfortable. I loaned Holly and Clara a pair of pajamas, and half an hour later, found myself sitting front row in the home theater while some werewolf-vampire romance movie played on the screen. I bit back a cackle when the tanned, obscenely muscular guy on the screen exploded in a mass of fur, his clothes shredded and billowing through the air like confetti. Out of all the inaccurate information I'd seen so far, they at least got that part right. I thought I was supposed to be escaping my troubles, but you've got us watching werewolves and vampires fight," I said teasingly. Cassidy's face broke out into a grin, her sea-glass eyes twinkling with laughter in the low light. She tossed a handful of popcorn into her mouth, groaning happily as she chewed. "Ugh, I just love popcorn. And hey, at least there's no witches in the movie." She giggled. Then she waggled her eyebrows and said, "Plus who doesn't like watching two attractive men fight over a girl? She needs to pick the werewolf. He's so hot." Clara murmured, her eyes fixated on the screen. Or, more specifically, fixated on the tanned shirtless man that walked across the screen. Brianna wrinkled her nose and turned to give Clara an incredulous look. "Blah, that wolf has a superiority complex or something. He's done nothing but boss her around. Plus it's weird that they can end up mated to a literal child. She needs to pick the vampire. At least he cares about what she wants. I don't know about you, but I like me a bossy man, and that vampire of hers is a good 100 years older than she is." Clara shot back, poking her tongue out. Brianna was visibly holding back laughter, her shoulders shaking as she bit out, "I like them bossy in the bedroom." "Oh, I'm sure wolf boy's bossy in the bedroom. These wolf men all have their dominant side," Clara replied, a knowing tone to her voice that none of us missed. Cassidy cocked an eyebrow at the witch. Lowering her voice, she murmured in my ear, "Something's telling me she's speaking from experience." Clara craned her head at us and snapped, "I heard that. I like the vampire." Holly's soft voice rang out, "He seems sweet." "Yeah, Holly. Us vampire lovers have to stick together," Brianna said smugly, earning a smile from my reserved half-sister. I sat back and enjoyed the rest of the movie, but not nearly as much as I enjoyed listening to everyone bicker. The fact that the other girls included Holly filled me with a lightness that made my head swim, though it could have been from the blood I was sipping. Before the end of the movie, Holly had come out of her shell and was actually cracking her own jokes, most of them about the main character's inability to stay on her own 2 feet. She was right though, that Bella girl was clumsy, especially for a human. After the movie, we migrated back into the living room where Cassidy had a few bottles of alcohol waiting. There was a mix of wine and liquor, though the liquor was most likely for us wolves. As far as I knew, vampires got intoxicated at the same rate as a human, and I don't think Holly had ever had alcohol before. She seemed to have no problem drinking wine though, cradling the goblet in her hands after emptying half a blood bag into the mix. Catching me eyeing her, she smiled shyly and held the glass out. "It's delicious, really. Would you like to try some?" I accepted her offer and took a small sip of the blood-laced wine. My eyebrows crept up my forehead at the flavor and the odd sensation it brought on. The blood made my heart race and heat flood my veins, while the alcohol provided a soothing buzz that amplified everything else. I could definitely get used to drinking it this way. She nodded knowingly, emptying another blood bag into a clean wine glass, and topping it off with alcohol. "I'd have a glass every night at dinner, you know, back then." Abruptly, Cassidy clapped her hands and gasped. "Oh, I know what we should do. Let's play Truth or Dare." Brianna shrugged like she didn't mind. When she caught my eye from across the room, she nodded in Clara's direction. It took me a moment to understand what she was getting at, but when I finally caught on, I was in full agreement. The five of us sat in a circle, each of us curled up on the sectional with a drink in our hands. Clara quickly explained the rules to Holly, who Cassidy decided would go first. "Holly, Truth or Dare?" the blonde bombshell to my left cooed. Holly pursed her lips, contemplating before responding. "I think I'll go with Dare. Our first dare of the night. Let's make this a good one." Cassidy clapped. I dare you to scare one of the guys. Doesn't matter which one, but make it good." Clara leaned forward in her seat, her full head of curls pulled back. "Mind if I use my magic to help her?" Cassidy tapped her chin. "That's fine, but Holly has to be the one to scare them." While Holly snuck into the kitchen, the four of us hid in the hallway. The lounge was a straight shot to the kitchen, which meant none of the guys would see us hunched over, our hands clasped over our mouths to stifle our laughter. Clara had one of her hands flat against the wall, feeling around for a few seconds before going still once more. I didn't ask, but I did pay close attention to what happened next. It took only a few minutes for the sound of footsteps to appear, growing louder until Kendrick's scent permeated the kitchen. He was singing under his breath to a song I didn't know the name of. I was sure that if I peeked around the corner, I'd see him bopping his head as he rummaged through the kitchen. There was a slight crackle in the air, like an electrical current had been unleashed. Brianna snorted and sputtered behind her hand when Clara's hair began to lift, and her curls frayed. Without warning, there was a loud pop, and the kitchen light went out. The entire room was bathed in darkness, but it was Kendrick we focused on. What the foo he had started to say, but I assume Holly took that moment to jump out because the next thing the four of us heard was a deep, masculine shout, followed by the deafening clank of pots and pans hitting the ground. Several seconds of silence passed when Kendrick huffed, "Aw man, you made me drop my cookies." "Oh, I'm sorry," Holly replied sweetly. "Would you say you were thoroughly frightened?" Yes. Yo, did Cass put you up to this? She knows I hate jump scares." "I was fulfilling a dare, actually." "Sorry about your cookies, again. Just curious, but why were they in your pocket? Do you always hoard food?" "Lola's grandmother is very kind, and I'm sure she would make you your own batch if you asked." Holly's innocent reply didn't disappoint and had all of us breaking our silence, starting with Brianna, as we exploded in laughter. After personally apologizing and promising Kendrick a plate of Grandma's lavender cookies, we headed back into the living room and continued with the game. Whether it was the blood, wine, or scaring the st out of Kendrick, Holly had finally loosened up and no longer fiddled with her fingers or picked at the hem of her PJs. She chose Brianna next, who quickly picked Truth, and proceeded to ask her about her relationship with Giovanni. There was a light blush staining my half-sister's cheeks as she asked about the ins and outs of their relationship. Brianna, who answered Holly's question gracefully, set her sights on Clara. Clara, Truth or Dare? The curly-haired witch set her glass of wine down and quickly ld the residue off her lips before smirking. I'll go with Truth. I know you've been chomping at the bit to ask me about my thing with Mason, so I'm giving you the chance for one question. My eager best friend gasped, clasping her hands together while contorting her face into a look of careful contemplation. From the years of studying Brianna's dramatic facial expressions, I could tell she was trying to figure out a way to get the most information possible. How would you describe your relationship with Mason? She asked, a self-satisfied tilt to her lips. Clara sat back on her haunches and took another sip of wine, putting as much consideration into her answer as Brianna had put into her question. Well, we're not dating, but I think we're on our way to it. He's been through a lot, but I'm sure you both already know all about that. I've been through my fair share that makes it hard to get close to people, but I like Mason. I've never been with a guy that's sweet like him. She confessed, pursing her lips. Through her tanned skin, I could see the clear heat of a blush staining her cheeks but decided not to comment on it. There were plenty more questions I had, but I kept those at bay. She and Mason would talk about things when they were ready. Before moving on with the game, Brianna let her know that she had our full support, which seemed to relieve some of the tension in Clara's shoulders. As the game progressed, each of us taking turns and bouncing back and forth between silly dares and heavy truths, I found myself being asked truth or dare by Cassidy. She had eyeliner smeared down half her face and ruby red lipstick on her jawline from where Clara had dared her to do a full face of makeup in a minute, making it impossible to take her seriously. Dare. Do your worst. I smirked, tapping my nails on the side of my glass. A devious grin overtook the soft curves of her face, and I knew Cassidy wouldn't disappoint. I've been saving this one up since that little power display of yours. What you said about your magic not having any limits, it got me thinking. She murmured, leaning in close to the four of us. Can you influence other people? Like, make them your slave? Clara said, her face twisting into a grimace. That don't feel right to me. Cassidy shook her head, her eyes widening. Goddess, no. I should have worded that better. I meant, I wondered if you could put a thought into someone's head, or an idea of sorts. Like, if I had to choose between a piece of chocolate cake or a salad, could you nudge me towards the salad? The girls bobbed their heads up and down, making sounds of understanding. I wasn't quite as convinced, though. The idea that I might be able to influence a person's mind didn't sit too well in my stomach, but I had to admit I was curious about the limits of my magic too. It's not taking away their will, per se. More like planting a thought and watching it take root. Cassidy explained. I stared at the two of them. I'm not sure. Is that your dare? Her lips twitched. Well, it's a bit more specific than that, but in essence, yeah. As long as I'm not taking away anyone's willpower, I'm game. I think I'd be more comfortable if we let the guys know first, though. Just to make sure everyone's on board. We don't have to tell them who the target is or what idea I'm putting in their head, but I feel like we should get permission before going forward with it. Everyone else seemed to agree, so I sent Maddox a quick message over MindLink and got a reply back seconds later. The guys were still in the lounge drinking, and from the mental image Maddox sent me, half of them were bordering on tipsy. Maddox himself would never relinquish control enough to get intoxicated, which was exactly why he wasn't tonight's target. Sean asks you don't mess with his hair again unless you're going to give him a beard to match. Maddox grunted. And yes, he made me say that. It took only a few minutes to choose the target and what thought I wanted to plant in their head. The act itself was all too easy, like with my magic alone a tether had been created between me and that person. Down that tether, I sent the thought and phrased it more as a suggestion than anything else. I still wasn't comfortable taking away someone's willpower, so there was a big chance this wouldn't work. To fight off the exhaustion that settled over my shoulders and tugged at my eyelids, working with the alcohol to make them heavy, Cassidy turned on some music. She began swaying her hips to the beat, letting her long blonde locks out of the clip they were twisted up in. Brianna was quick to follow, leaping off the couch and grabbing my hands before I could curl up on one of the plush cushions. "Oh, no you don't. When was the last time we danced?" She snorted her question at me, her raised eyebrow giving me my answer. I groaned but let her pull me to my feet. Grinning like a cat, she bowed and held out her hand for me to take. Lifting her chin, she asked, "May I have this dance, almighty Queen Luna Lola?" Laughter bubbled in my chest and exploded from my mouth, widening her cheesy grin. When I was finally able to speak, I sputtered a reply. "If you never call me that again, yes." As we took turns twirling one another, our hands clasped and limbs weightless, I noticed Clara teaching Holly how to dance. Her cheeks were bright red, turning deeper by the second when Clara started shimmying her wide hips and shaking her bottom. "Oh, I don't think I can do that," she squeaked, a hand over her mouth. I twirled Brianna under my arm and shouted to Holly, "Did I ever tell you the first time I met Tristan was in a nightclub?" Holly blinked at me, surprise erasing some of her shyness. "No, you didn't. He wouldn't dance either, but I think you could get him to try." I winked, paying close attention to how her blush began to spread, crawling down her neck in a sea of fire. For a while I had my suspicions about Tristan and Holly, though neither one would admit anything. There was this protective side of Tristan that I admired, but it seemed to change in regard to my half-sister. When it came to keeping me safe, he was acting out of respect and an undying duty to his queen. With Holly, it was different. I wasn't going to pry, but it didn't hurt to let her know I supported whatever they had, or didn't have, either way. As time went on and the songs ticked by, I'd forgotten about the dare Cassidy had given me. It all came rushing back when Zeke popped into the living room, a brownie in his hand and his foot already tapping along to the beat. I was the first to notice when he started shaking and rolling his hips, his eyes closed as he began singing along to the Taylor Swift song that played. Before long, all five of us were giggling behind our hands, watching the oblivious alpha dance his heart out while munching on a leftover brownie he must have smuggled away. In the entryway leading out into the hall, the face of my mate appeared, flanked by the other guys. Maddox's surprised expression alone had me crumpling, his eyebrows vanishing into his hair as he watched his closest friend dance to Taylor Swift. Mason was bopping his head as he watched, while Tristan and Giovanni looked more confused than anything else. "Hey, you've got moves!" Kendrick shouted, pushing past the guys to join Zeke. Zeke's eyes popped open, a lopsided grin on his face that quickly morphed into a look of realization. His arm shot out to point at me, but he didn't stop dancing. I looked sheepishly at him, shrugging my shoulders as I feigned innocence. "You know what, I'm not even mad." He shrugged. "I happen to love this song." The chime of the doorbell ringing began to flood the house, muffled beneath the strum of the guitar playing on the speakers. I shouted to the rest of them that I'd be right back, but they were all enamored with Zeke's skills. Surprisingly enough, he did know how to move. If he wasn't an alpha, I'd say a career of male stripping was in his future. As I turned the corner and headed into the foyer, the last thing I saw was Zeke plucking Brianna off the couch to twirl and spin in the middle of the living room. Her carefree laughter mixed with the raspy sound of her mate's growl, bringing a smile to my face. Even while mourning her parents, my best friend still had joy in her heart. Through the hazy glass covering the dual front doors, I could see the blurry figure of someone standing on the patio. I opened the door an inch and standing on the patio was a woman just a few years older than myself. She lived down the street from us and was technically our neighbor even though the forest was nestled between our houses. From my constant trips into town to go to training sessions or to visit my dad and grandma, I knew the woman had a young daughter and a mate that loved to dote on the two of them. Her eyes were large, but soft, and reflected a kind light that made me like her instantly. She half waved, drawing my attention downward, to the package in her hand. "Hey, Luna. Sorry to interrupt your night, but this was delivered to me by mistake. I swung by earlier, but you weren't home and I didn't want to just leave it on your porch. It has overnight expedited stickers on the front, so I figured it was important." I took the package from her hand, which was nothing more than a slender bubble envelope large enough to fit a sheet of paper. "Thank you so much. I appreciate it." She waved again, smiling as she bid me a good night. Clicking the lock on the front door, I turned and tore into the package. The label on the front said it was shipped from almost halfway across the country but had no name or company to tell me who it had come from. As I tore it open, a letter fluttered out, drifting to the floor. On the front of the letter was one word. A name, actually. Brianna. As if that wasn't harrowing enough, it gets worse. Inside the bubble envelope was a small stack of papers. It wasn't very many, no more than 5, but the thick material made it bulkier. The moment my fingertips grazed the paper's rough surface, I was struck upside the head with recognition. The book Giovanni had given me on my family, it had the same type of paper. Following my gut, I pulled the papers out of the envelope and ran my finger down the edge, feeling the frayed pieces from where they'd been torn from the book. On the front was a sticky note covered in scribbles of ink, the bottom signed by Brianna's parents. The writing was clearly rushed, but as I made out the words and meaning behind them, my stomach began to plummet. "Lola, we pray to the goddess these find you in time and not some other soul. Protect this information with your life, there are people who will kill for it. They know we stole it, and they're hunting us now. If we don't make it, give Brianna the letter we included and tell her we love her. You've been a wonderful friend to her since you've come back into her life, and all that we ask is that you use what you've learned to keep her safe, to keep them all safe." When I came back inside the living room, nothing had changed. Zeke was still dancing with Brianna while Giovanni watched with a mixture of irritation and adoration on his face. Tristan continued to glance at Holly, who was curled up on the couch watching the two dance with blush-stained cheeks. Clara and Mason looked like they wanted to join in, while Cassidy laughed at Kendrick's terrible moves. Only Maddox noticed me come back in, his dark stare soft as it turned to my face. There must have been some fragment of truth in my expression because his eyebrows slid into a grimace and his jaw tightened. "What is it?" he asked, coming to my side. I held the papers in my grasp, still trying to process what I'd just read. The envelope with Brianna's name on the front sat at the very top, another hole in my heart because I knew this letter would dampen her mood. It was from her parents, a last farewell to their only daughter before they were MD. The single envelope felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every head in the room turned to Maddox and I, hearing the question he'd asked me and seeing the truth on my face. Tristan was at my side in an instant, followed by Brianna. Giovanni hovered at her back protectively, as though he could shield her from whatever had gone wrong. The neighbor just brought this over. Apparently, it was delivered to the wrong house. I said, my voice low and eyes darting up to meet Brianna's. It's from your parents. My best friend in a sharp breath, her large brown eyes instantly watering. They scanned the papers in my hands, latching onto the envelope that stood out against the tanned pages that had been torn from the book on my family's history. Is that for me? Her voice trembled as she asked. I swallowed the knot in my throat. They left it for you, in case they didn't make it. Her lower lip began to tremble, and she brought her hand up to hide it just as Giovanni pulled her into his arms. I looked up at the vampire that towered over her, that protected her with the same fervor he protected me with. Take her to my bedroom or one of the spares. I'm sure she doesn't want an audience. I murmured, handing him the envelope with pain clutching my heart. Zeke, who had been hovering on the outskirts, cocked his head. Those papers are from the book, aren't they? What do they say? I gave a small shake of my head, one that said, not here. It's not that I didn't trust everyone else in the room, but my insides were so shaken that I wasn't sure I'd be able to utter the words around this many people. Mason's voice rang out, snaring all of our attention. He had his arm around Clara's shoulder, but his words weren't just directed to her. Mind if we grab some of those leftovers you got stashed away? I'm starved, he said, rubbing his toned stomach. There was a knowing look on his face, but it was laced with sympathy that told me he understood completely. Clara hummed, holding back laughter. She batted her eyelashes at Mason, making him smile. You're always hungry, but I could use a snack too. Alcohol gives me the munchies. Kendrick nodded, oblivious to the tension in the room. I second that. Plus there's never a bad time for a burger. Go ahead and dig in, I said, forcing a smile onto my face. Mason and Clara headed into the kitchen with Cassidy and Kendrick following closely behind. The blonde in charge of hosting tonight's sleepover had a concerned look on her face, and clear reluctance in her eyes as she left us alone. Holly appeared around Tristan's shoulder, tapping it gently to get his attention. I think I'm going to go with them. I could use another blood bag, she whispered, her eyes flickering over the rest of us. Tristan nodded, something in the depths of his icy gaze thawing as he looked down at my half-sister. Giovanni put them in the ice box in the garage. Once Holly had padded out of the living room, leaving only Maddox, Zeke, Tristan, and myself, I knelt down in front of the coffee table and spread the papers out for them to see. Maddox flicked on the television, cranking the volume up to drown out our voices. They were made of the same thick material as in the book. Even the writing and ink were the same, elegant and lilting as someone with an expert hand painted them across the page. The frayed edges only proved further that they were the missing pages, but it did nothing to explain how they'd gotten that way to begin with, or who had taken them. Each one of the guys passed around the sticky note that was attached to the front, their eyes scheming over the last words of Brianna's parents before they were KD. The witches are the ones that KD them, so it stands they most likely had the pages to begin with. We need to prepare for the possibility that they already know. Tristan pointed out, his mind on the same track as my own. I chewed anxiously on my lower lip, picking at the skin that come up from the last time I bit into it. We need to pray to the goddess that they don't, I whispered, staring down at the pages. What? Zeke mumbled, his eyes sliding back and forth as they traversed each page with rapt interest. He slid a hand down his face, which had paled considerably. This is bad. Maddox, who had been silent this entire time, pinched the bridge of his nose and suppressed a snarl. Can someone explain? On any other occasion, Tristan would have taken that moment to poke fun at Maddox. He would have gotten into him for being too impatient and high-strung to read. The stoic vampire said nothing, looking expectantly at Zeke and I as he too waited for an explanation. Zeke looked up at me, a light I'd never seen before in his eyes. They'd always been full of warmth and friendliness, and while they weren't exactly distrusting, there was a wariness there that I found myself hating. Do you want to, or should I? Go ahead. I croaked, not trusting my voice. The first page is saying there are no limits to conjuration, but that there are certain side effects. The side effects the witch experiences are dependent on where the power comes from. It goes on to describe these two different planes of existence. They're kind of like heaven and hell, only think of them as dark and light. There's no way to travel to these planes, but they're the sources of magic that all witches pull from. Even the evil ones pull from light without knowing it, since the dark plane is so hard to access. There are some in history that have accessed the dark plane, but only in small amounts. Conjuration acts like a key to both planes, and lets the witch pull from them freely, drawing as much power as she wants. He explained, pausing to give Maddox and Tristan a moment to catch up. Tristan's grimace held a hint of confusion. How is this knowledge dangerous? He hasn't even gotten to the good part yet. I said, my lips pressed in a thin line. Zeke tapped the second page in the stack. It gives an example. It talks about one of Lola's ancestors who pulled from the dark plane, drawing more power than any other witch has in existence. The spell killed an entire town of people, but it worked. The dim lighting paired with the pressure filling the room, the air from the four walls, left me lightheaded and shivering. I slid my hands beneath my TS to hide the tremble in them. Maddox leaned forward in his seat. What did the spell do? Instead of looking at Maddox, Zeke met my eyes as he spoke. The spell created something. Something dark and never before seen by our world. It created the shadows. Tristan's already pale skin grew paler, like wet tissue paper draped over cobalt veins. The shadows? You're sure? He asked. Zeke nodded, his face grim. He tapped the page a second time. Positive. It says it right here. Not sure why the shadows are willing to make deals with the vampire monarchs, but if I had to guess, it may be the fact that both vampires and the shadows drink blood. Why would she create the shadows? For what purpose? Tristan scowled. Humans, witch hunters, had taken her baby. They thought witchcraft was taught, not passed down through the generations. They didn't know her baby had magic of its own. Either way, she couldn't allow them to take her child, so she acted. I replied, my eyes glued to the pages. There had been this force inside of me that demanded to know the truth. Why would anyone create something like the shadows? The thought that this dark entity had been birthed from one of my ancestors' thoughts made my skin erupt in goosebumps. I couldn't stop myself from reading the pages, desperate to know more. The answer brought not a speck of comfort. Maddox ran his fingers through his hair, tugging at the roots before letting go. We can work with that. It just means that Lola is more powerful than any of us thought. My mate's eyes met my own, and in their golden depths I saw understanding so pure and strong that it made me want to weep. I wanted to find reassurance in Maddox, but I couldn't let myself. He had no clue how much worse it got, but soon, he would. There's more. Zeke said. The witch that created the shadows went too far. Tapping into that kind of magic is addicting, and even doing it once can get you hooked. It says here that she lost her mind, and that the dark magic had changed her over time. Before she was MD by other witches, her sisters, she'd created what the humans called the Black DH. Tristan locked eyes with Maddox, his icy blue against my mate's warm gold. Something passed between them, an agreement of sorts. It was the first time I'd seen them wholeheartedly on the same team. The four of us went silent, but the truth hovered in the air around us, demanding to be given life. It was Tristan that spoke the words on all our minds, solidifying the fact that we were losing this battle and that our worst nightmares, they were so close to becoming reality. If they're able to control Lola, they could quite literally erase both our species from existence. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audio book will be continued in next episode.